I'm Dan Kenson, Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center. This is our distinguished lecture, our community address given by our distinguished visiting professor. Let me just do a very brief introduction of Jeffery Robinson, who is, well, has had and is still having an amazing career. He's a real role model for those who seek the incredible value of a life devoted to meaningful work. And if I may say so, that should be all. I was going to say that should be all of you, but what I want to say is that should be all of us. So if you want to see how to have a life devoted to meaningful work, talk to Jeff. He's a graduate of Marquette University and Harvard Law School with 4 decades of experience working on criminal and racial justice issues as a public defender in private practice, and then at the ACLU as Deputy Legal Director and the Director of the Trone Center for Justice and Equality. He's a faculty member of the National Criminal Defense College, past president of the Washington Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and a winner of the prestigious William O. Douglas Award. You might think, well, that seems like a great career, congratulations, which we would say, but there is much more. In 2021, Jeffery left the ACLU to launch the Who We Are Project, a nonprofit organization working to expose and promote the historical truths of anti-Black racism in the United States. I'm sure he will tell us a bit about that great project, as he did during the screening of a documentary film about it that we showed last week. And by the way, you can see that film, that documentary on Netflix. You can look for the Who We Are Project and get a sense of that event. Also, I think we recorded the rest of that event through the Rappaport Center website. You can see that as well. I'll say it's as important and inspiring a project as I can imagine, and one which I think we should all support however we can. His lecture today is deeply connected to that project. It's entitled, "What Heritage Are You Talking About? Confederate Monuments in the United States." I am absolutely thrilled that Jeff is with us this semester. He's already been a generous member of our community, and please join me in welcoming him to this community lecture.
Thank you all a lot. I'm going to stand over here by the microphone, and I'm going to jump right into this. That is Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson on Stone Mountain, Georgia. And there are people that will tell you that Stone Mountain, Georgia, is about something other than glorifying those who maimed and murdered United States soldiers in defense of owning enslaved people. Now, the South lost the war, but they won the peace because they redefined what the Civil War was about until the shades of history have kind of made it a little murky. And what I'm going to do is fairly simple and fairly direct. As opposed to talking about what people alive today think about why the Civil War happened and their views and opinions about why the Civil War happened, I'm just going to show you what the people that fought the Civil War had to say, what they said, what they did, and when they were honored for what they said and what they did, to see if that can provide some context about this topic. So let me give you a little background on Stone Mountain. Because in 1915, William Joseph Simmons went to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and he took with him bricks to make an altar, a Holy Bible, an American flag, an unsheathed sword, and a burning cross. And he reinstituted the KKK. That memorial on Stone Mountain is the largest bas relief in the world. It was conceived in 1912 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the north face of the mountain was deeded to them in 1916, and they combined with the KKK to begin creating this mural, but they ran out of money. But don't worry, the state of Georgia stepped in and with money, including tax money, or at least some funds that came from descendants of enslaved people, they finished that. And you know when they finished it? 1972, 4 years after Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The seeds of that memorial, the seeds of the Civil War, which I'm suggesting to you is what that memorial was about, those seeds were laid a lot earlier, 70 years earlier. And this is how they were laid. They were laid in our Constitution very, very specifically. And since the internet hadn't been invented yet, people in constitutional conventions up and down the East Coast of the United States had meetings and they wrote letters to each other. And this is how we know what they were thinking. So y'all remember Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death? Well, Patrick Henry was a citizen of Virginia, and this is what he was concerned about. We may not have the sound, I'm just going to say it. May Congress not say that every Black man must fight? Did we not see a little of this in the last war? We were not so hard pressed as to make emancipation general, but acts of assembly passed that every Black who would go to the army should be free. I see, and this is Patrick Henry, I see with this situation, the property of the people of Virginia in jeopardy and their peace and tranquility gone. That's what he wrote. This is how James Madison responded. And I'm just going to see if I can get us some sound. Nope. James Madison, father of the Constitution. I was struck with surprise when I heard Patrick Henry talking about emancipation of slaves. There is no power to warrant it in that paper, the Constitution. If there be, I know it not. So this is what the founding fathers are saying about the institution of slavery. Patrick Henry came back because he wasn't finished. In this state, there are 236,000 Blacks, and there are many more in the southern states, but fewer none in the northern states. And what he goes on to say is, if there should happen to be an insurrection of enslaved people, we got to go to Congress to get guns. Because after this new Constitution, Congress is the only one who can arm the militia. Now, if this was a class about the Second Amendment, we would be talking about not the only reason for the Second Amendment, but one of the reasons for the Second Amendment. And if you want to go back and look at the first draft of the Second Amendment talked about the necessity of a free country. And if you look back at the Second Amendment as it exists today, it's about the necessity of a free state. Part of the reason for the Second Amendment was arming the Southern people so that they could keep enslaved people enslaved. But that 236,000 Blacks, we're coming back to that, I promise you. And then finally, this guy, Colonel Charles Pinckney from South Carolina. He was like the Rodney King of the Constitutional Convention. Can't we all just get along? And he's like, don't worry. There's no power in this document to emancipate enslaved people. So we don't have to be concerned with that. Well, that's our Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 and Article 2, Section 1 protect slavery against the popular vote. Most people thought that the 3/5 clause was about dehumanizing Black people, and it was. But the 3/5 clause was about that next amendment, which created the Electoral College. Multiply 236,000 by 3/5, and you still get a big number, especially when you consider how small the population of the country was back then. And what does that big number mean? It's added to the Virginia population, which determines how many Congress people they get and how many Electoral College votes they get. And if you're wondering if it had an impact, 9 of the first 12 presidents were from the South. And 7 of those 9 were from Virginia. Article 4, Section 2, engaged law enforcement nationwide because this document literally made Black people's attempt to be free unconstitutional and illegal. And then Article 1, Section 9 and Article 5, protect the transatlantic trade and enslaved people against state action. Article 1, Section 9 says that we're not going to ban the migration or importation of such persons because they didn't want to use the word slave or enslaved in the Constitution. It was ugly, so they called them such persons. This is one of the first examples of just calling it something that it's not, to pretend that it's something different than what it is. But what this amendment or what this article of the Constitution did is to say the transatlantic slave trade keeps going until 1808, no stopping it. And then somebody said, because people say that people who wrote the Constitution were brilliant, and they were. They sat around talking and they're like, okay, but what if some states get together and try and amend the Constitution and get rid of Article 1, Section 9? So they just added a new article saying you can't amend Article 1, Section 9 until 1808. If you have any question about how deeply the white supremacist views of those who founded our country ran, look at what's in our Constitution. They are telling you as clearly as they can what they think about the concept of enslaving people. And this is what slavery was. Not something else, but this. And this book by the Sublets is a history of the American slave breeding process, because Black women were bred like cattle to produce children to carry on America's production of cotton, rice, and tobacco. And two of the biggest farms, one was on the Maryland Eastern Shore, and I believe the other one was like Richmond, Virginia, or somewhere around there. Richmond, Virginia, the Maryland Eastern Shore. And if you read some of the quote unquote slave narratives that the United States government did at the beginning of the 20th century, where they were interviewing people that had been enslaved, and the women that say, oh yeah, they would put a guy in a room with a bunch of women that they wanted children from. And they would put a bag over his head so that he wouldn't see who he was having sex with, because it might be his mother or his sister or somebody else that was related. This is important when it comes to Confederate monuments, because we do not honor everyone who went to a war and killed somebody. We honor people who go to a war and kill other people because of what they were fighting for. That makes all the difference. And it's one of the reasons why people are trying to erase this history, especially when it comes to Confederate monuments, because this is what they were fighting for. And you say, well, what did that really mean in terms of the United States and what was going on then? At the turn of the 1860s, right before the Civil War started, this was the economics. Yearly cotton production, 2.3 billion pounds a year. And I say this in different lectures that I've given, and I just find that repetition is important. If any of you have ever held a ball of cotton in your hand, you know that it weighs virtually nothing. So how much of that do you think you had to pick to get to 2.3 billion pounds? I can't tell you how much, but I can tell you how many people it took. 4 million enslaved people. 700,000 enslaved people in the 1790 census. By 1860, it was 4 million. That's how they picked the cotton. Value of enslaved people at $3.5 billion in 1860 dollars. That's about 100 billion in today's money. And one of the richest places in the world was the Mississippi Valley, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi. One of the poorest places in America today, because that free labor ain't there anymore. And enslaved people weren't just free labor. They were sold, so that means there were taxes. You could take out a loan, you could get insurance. They were simply part of the economic train that was growing America into a very rich country. So, why were people fighting in the Civil War? It is fairly clear and plain if you are willing to listen to what they have to say. You're not going to hear this video, but you can see, I'm going to start it again, because you can see what he's saying. Excuse me, this is a general of the United States Army who is going to be defending Robert E. Lee. This is what he had to say. I would tell you Robert E. Lee was an honorable man. He was a man that gave up his country to fight for his state, which 150 years ago was more important than country. The lack of an ability to compromise led to the Civil War. And men and women of good faith on both sides made their stand where their conscience had them make their stand. Now, that is the narrative that is pushed in America all over the place about why the Civil War happened. And there's a problem with that. The lack of an ability to compromise led to the Civil War. Well, how about, I don't know, the 3/5 compromise in relationship to the Electoral College in the Constitution? How about the 1808 compromise in the Constitution? How about the 1820 Missouri Compromise? How about the 1850 Missouri Compromise? How about the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act? America was always willing to compromise about the conditions under which Black people would be owned as property. That was simply a lie. I know we're trying to give facts and not opinions, so I'm sorry, my opinion slipped in. That's not a mistake. This guy is a general in the United States Army. You telling me he doesn't know military history? But the excuses turned the Civil War into something other than what it was really about, so that we can then honor the people who maimed and murdered human beings for their cause. This guy at least was honest about it. Nathan Bedford Forrest, and this statue was in the State House in the state of Tennessee until just recently. What Nathan Bedford Forrest said about the Civil War: if we ain't fighting to keep slavery, then what the hell are we fighting for? And to make it absolutely clear, let's just go quickly through what the states had to say. Here's the state of Mississippi. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. And they went on because they said, we must submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede. And you know what they did? They chose the $4 billion of money. And by the way, the people that you see reading, and unfortunately we just don't have the sound, but when we filmed this movie, the documentary film, we did a theater presentation in Town Hall. And so there were actors that were reading letters and other historical documents. And it just saved my voice some, but luckily I got a fresh voice today, so we're in good shape. Texas. And let me tell you, this is one of the least offensive things in the Texas statement. The non-slave holding states, the people in those states have formed themselves into a great sectional party based on the unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. And listen to this, please. Proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of the divine law. Do you think they were joking when they said this? Can you understand how deeply these feelings had to run for them to write this shit, pardon my French, down on paper for history to see? Because that's what they were doing. They were breaking up the United States of America. They knew that they were making history, and they wrote it down so nobody would have any question about what they were doing. The action of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration on the part of a great majority of the Northern people of hostility to the South, her property, and her institutions. South Carolina, the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Georgia, for the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states, that meant the northern states, with reference to the subject of African slavery, not reference to the subject of something else, reference to African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express custodial obligations, obligations to us in reference to that property. Can I see a quick show of hands? Were any of you taught in high school that there was more than one reason for the Civil War? You just look around the classroom. Were any of you taught these statements in high school that have your hands up? Why is it that you think you weren't taught this? Why is it that you think people don't want you to know this? Louisiana, the people of the slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. And if you need more, here is the Vice President of the Confederacy in his cornerstone speech, meaning the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And he is saying it as clearly as he can. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This is why they maimed and murdered American soldiers, not for some other reason, for this reason. How about the state of Florida? I just went down there last week and spoke to some folks in Jacksonville about Confederate monuments, and I had to do some sleuthing because Florida doesn't have a published declaration of causes for why they left the Union. And what you find when you do research is that in January of 1861, a committee was appointed to write this declaration of a statement of why they're leaving the Union. And then in April of 1861, the committee was just disbanded and there was no explanation. I think they were quite frankly busy with a whole lot of other stuff. But historians were going through all these documents in Florida, and what they came upon in the state archives, Series 577, Carton 1, folder number 6, was a draft of the Florida Statement. And I think it puts into context these monuments. This is from the bottom of a Confederate monument in Florida, and I want to read it to you. In memory of the women of our Southland, 1861 to 1865, let this mute but eloquent structure speak to the generations to come of a generation of the past. So let's tell the generations to come about those who came before us. Let it repeat perpetually the imperishable bravery, I think it is, of our women of the 60s, meaning the 1860s. Those noble women who sacrificed their all upon their country's altar. Their country wasn't the United States of America, it was the Confederate States of America between 1861 and 1865. And those dates are important because Confederate monuments were made to honor people for what they did during that time period. Not during some other time, but during that time period. And so what were the women of Florida doing to put their all on the altar of their country? Well, here is that monument in Florida. And as you can see, it's a big monument, and inside or in the covered area, there's a woman reading to two children. The young girl seems to be looking right at you, and the young boy is looking down at the book. And what is it that you think she's teaching those children about why their fathers and their uncles and their older brothers had to go off to war? Well, I suggest this is what they were teaching them, what came from that draft statement, because it gives us insight into what these monuments are about. And here's what they said. There is an open disregard of constitutional obligation and the rights and interests of the slave-holding states, and a deep and enduring hostility to the people of these states. That's why they went to war. The congressional halls has been, and it's a draft, so there's, some of the, don't worry about the language. The congressional halls has been prostituted to the daily denunciation and vituperation, if I can say that, of the slave-holding states, thus subjecting the members from these states to the degradation of gross and constantly repeated insults. White people are being made uncomfortable because they're being criticized about slavery. They're being criticized about racism. Does this sound familiar? There are laws in the United States right now saying you can't teach stuff to children if it makes white people uncomfortable. And that's part of why I'm saying this. This is not new. None of this stuff is like, oh my God, they're just doing this. This stuff has a history that is literally as old as our country. But they weren't done. The slaves, get this one, their rapid increase, which is the highest evidence of the humanity of their owners. Think about that in reference to the breeding farms. What must the conditions of the slaves themselves be when their number becomes so large that their labor will be of no value to their owners? Their natural tendency everywhere shown where the race has existed to idleness, vagrancy, and crime will be increased by an inability to prove or provide sustenance. This is what they thought. And this is what they were saying about why the Civil War happened. This last one is as clear as it can be. It is in so many words saying to you, we will not burn you at the stake, but we will torture you to death by a slow fire. We will not confiscate your property and consign you to a residence and equality with the African, but that destiny certainly awaits your children. And to finish this off with the Confederate flag itself, because we're talking about monuments, but the Confederate flag is itself a monument. William T. Thompson is the designer of one of the Confederate flags. And you can see here, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematic, a national emblem in its significance of our higher cause, the cause of a superior race and a higher civilization contending against ignorance, infidelity, and barbarism. This is what he is calling the job of the South. Now that's the Confederate flag that William T. Thompson designed. And if you look into the history, what you will see is that there were a whole bunch of Confederate flags. But the one that we are all most familiar with is that one, the battle flag of North Virginia. And in case you think that flag means something different than all the other monuments, simply look at what the people of Virginia had to say about why they went to war. Having declared that the powers granted them under the said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States and might be resumed whensoever the same should be perverted, to their injury and oppression, and the federal government having perverted said powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. And if you need more about what the people of Virginia thought on this topic, just look at what they did in their colonial days, because these are the laws that they passed then. Children of enslaved mothers are also enslaved because they knew that white men were raping Black women. And they just wanted to be clear in case that baby comes out with blue eyes or freckles. Don't go thinking that's a human being. That's an enslaved being. By the charity and piety of their owners, enslaved people were becoming Christian. And if I tell you that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior and you're a Christian, don't you kind of have to treat me like a person? But Virginia passed a law saying, don't worry about that, because the only way an enslaved person could be a Christian would be through the charity and piety of their owner. An enslaved person who was killed while resisting a master, the law was passed. Just make sure that's not a felony. That's not a crime. The slave, I guess he should have complied. Does that sound familiar in 2022? And Virginia, in that time period, 1689 to 1865, enacted more than 130 quote unquote slave statutes. The point being, the law was involved in this up to the neck. So this is what the monuments are about. I'm not going to be able to quote all of this, but I'm going to be able to quote a lot of it. This is what he had to say about Robert E. Lee. People don't go to war over things like privilege. They go to war over property and power. And that's what Virginia went to war for. And Lee followed Virginia. Not because he particularly loved slavery, although he certainly didn't hate it, but because he didn't have the moral and ethical courage to stand up to his family and his clan. And then he says, it is ridiculous to excuse Robert Lee. Either he knew what slavery was when he maimed and murdered thousands in its defense, or he did not. If he did not know what slavery was, he was a fool. If he did know what it was, then he was a traitor and a rebel, not only to his country, but to his country's God. That's what W.E.B. Du Bois had to say about Robert E. Lee and other quote unquote Confederate heroes. So wrapping this up, when were most of these monuments built? Because do you think, well, it was right after the Civil War, there was so much passion and feeling, and people would have been, feeling these people gave their lives for us, and now we want to honor them. Well, I don't think so. 157 years of Confederate iconography shows us that's what happened by the end of the Civil War. And look what happened next. And if you want to know the next spike, it was during the Civil Rights Movement. Why do you think there are no monuments in Germany to German soldiers who fought from 1939 to 1945? Ask American soldiers. There were German soldiers who acted in the most brave and courageous ways on the battlefield that you'd ever see. So why aren't there monuments there? Maybe it's because of what they fought for. And we think, let me be clear. I ain't comparing anything to the Holocaust because it just doesn't make any sense. But what I will compare are the theories that were behind it, because they are universal and they are repeating themselves. And we should understand that the Nazis got the basis for the Nuremberg laws from America's separate but equal, from America's Jim Crow laws. Read this book, and I will just show you the titles of the subsection of the first two chapters. The first Nuremberg Law of New York Jews and Nazi flags. America, the global leader in racist immigration law. American second-class citizenship. The Nazis looked to American second-class citizenship. Chapter 2. Battles in the Ministries, the Prussian Memorandum, and the American Example, the sources of Nazi knowledge of American law. Here's one of the quotes from the book. One of the most striking Nazi views was that Jim Crow was a suitable racist program in the United States because American Blacks were already oppressed and poor. But then in Germany, by contrast, where the Jews, as the Nazis imagined it, were rich and powerful, it was necessary to take more severe measures. The distance between the philosophy that happened there and some of the philosophy here, explicitly the philosophy behind the Civil War, there was no difference. What else was happening during this time period, about 1896 to about 1924 or 25? Well, how about this? Black massacres in America where virtually no one was ever arrested. You've got Wilmington in 1898, Atlanta in 1906, Springfield, Illinois in 1908, Slocum, Texas in 1910, East St. Louis in 1917, Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, Washington, D.C. in 1919. I think Osceola, Florida in 1920, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, Rosewood, Florida, 1923. These are massacres where Black people are losing their lives. Law enforcement is not responding. And between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 racial terror lynchings in the United States documented by EJI. Those are the documented ones. So this is what's happening in the country at the same time these Confederate monuments are being built. Where are the monuments? That's where they are. This was done by an organization about 6 years ago, and there are a couple of monuments in northern and western states that aren't on here, but this is a pretty accurate representation. Those are the top 10 states for the monuments. And if you add Kentucky and Arkansas, what's really interesting is those are the top 10 states when it comes to lynchings in the United States. I'm going to go back to this because this is what I'm going to end with. This man is Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was an advisor to Strom Thurmond, to Ronald Reagan, to George H.W. Bush. He was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And this is what he had to say in an interview about the Southern strategy. And why I'm showing this is to show you the idea of you call it something other than what it is, and then that justifies you supporting it. I'm going to say right now, maybe it's good that I'm going to read it as it goes along, but you will be triggered by this language. This is not my language. This is Lee Atwater's language. And notice why he says to the press, now y'all don't quote me on this. Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist or as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all don't quote me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct probably is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that if it's getting that abstract and that coded, we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner. That's where I want to stop. And this is it's a difficult presentation. It's about our history. If you were taught that there were other reasons besides slavery for the Civil War, ask yourself why that was. Did they say states' rights? Yeah, the states' rights to own people as property. Did they say Southern culture? Yeah, that's right. The culture of white supremacy. If you deny what the Civil War is about, you can defend the monuments. If you don't deny what the Civil War is about, then why do we have monuments on public land paid for with public money to honor people who maimed and murdered American soldiers? It doesn't make sense to me. So if there are any questions or comments, I want to take those. We still have a little bit of time. I appreciate y'all's attention. I'm sorry for the little technical glitches, but I think I got the point across. Any questions that folks have?
We have microphones. We think they work, but there's no guarantee. Hey, can you yell?
How deep do you think is the connection between policing and white supremacy? And do you think that's a solvable problem?
It has to be a solvable problem. Did everybody hear the question? How deep do you think the connection is between policing and white supremacy, and is it a solvable problem? I think the connection is becoming much more clear because there's much more information about it. There have been probably 5 articles since the beginning of this year about white supremacist groups that have infiltrated law enforcement. And in Philadelphia, there was a whole list of white supremacist emails and text messages that different officers had sent. I think part of it is we're starting to see the level of the problem instead of ignoring or pretending that it's not there. I think it's important when you think about policing to go back to the Constitution. We, when I say we, I mean the people who created our country, we gave police the job of controlling the Black community and making sure that they weren't free. Police departments didn't ask for that job. We gave it to them, and we gave it to them in the document that founded our country. So if you're asking yourself, why is this all this, animosity between Black communities and police? And what human beings have a tendency to do is to only go back so far in history as you can particularly remember, or maybe as your parents can particularly remember. And the problem is much deeper than that. In the South, police departments formed out of slave patrols. This is not an argument. You can go and look at the facts. Slave patrols wore badges. Andrew Jackson in 1803, President of the United States, put an article in the newspaper saying, an enslaved person escaped from me. I'll pay you $50 if you catch him. I'll pay any expenses that you have to undergo to keep him. And I'll pay you $10 extra for every 100 lashes you will give him, to the amount of 300. He put this in the newspaper, knowing that no police were going to come knocking at his door saying, you can't advertise for a man to be hit with a whip 300 times, it'll probably kill him. You can't put that in the newspaper, but he knew he could do it. So I think the problem with law enforcement is incredibly deep. And the 2 things that I would say is, if you think that more policing will make you safer, we have a 150-year history that shows that's simply not true. In numerous cities, including Memphis, Tennessee, where there's been all kinds of problems recently, they showed over a 7-year period, crime went down at the same time they were having fewer police. Police respond to crime. They do not prevent crime. And in every single city in America that has instituted a quote unquote stop and frisk policy, I'm not talking about the stop and frisk where you see a guy running down the street with a crowbar, glass falling off of his arm and carrying a car stereo, and the police officer says, excuse me, sir, but I think you may have broken into a car. That's not the stop and frisk I'm talking about. I'm talking about the New York City stop and frisk, the Philadelphia stop and frisk. In each of those cities, a minimum of 75% of the people they stopped had done nothing. Nothing. Ask yourself if you're willing to live in a community where the cops are going to stop people for no reason whatsoever. And 75% of them are not going to have done anything wrong. That's not the way you stop crime. So we have to reimagine policing, and it will be a huge, huge endeavor because people on both sides of the aisle are talking about more money for police. But we are having discussions about the role of police that have never occurred in this country before. It ain't going to happen in a minute, but policing in America is in the spotlight, and we will see what the next 10 to 15 years will bring. And quite frankly, a lot of that is going to be on y'all, because you're the ones who are going to be in jobs that are going to be wrestling with this stuff, while people like me are going to be retired. Other question? Yes. Yes.
So I just want to ask, I guess about the culpability. I guess you could use that word. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to talk to this. You know, if you think about, I don't know, the thought that comes to mind is like the Dukes of Hazzard, you know, the car, the Confederate, like, you know, people who culturally maybe relate to symbols like that, but they themselves might not be educated on all the history or harbor, you know, pro-slavery sentiment themselves, but at the same time are using or related to you know, symbols and sort of cultural touchstones that are problematic. How do you assess their culpability and how to think about folks like that who might not necessarily be thinking about some of the things you talked about, but the symbol, you know, indicates what it does nonetheless?
I think the truth is the truth. And people have you can't just say, well, this is my opinion, and so I'm free to have my opinion. You are free to have your opinion and to speak your opinion. That's the First Amendment in the United States. But the First Amendment doesn't say you get to speak some bullshit and not have consequences about it. If you speak your opinion with the First Amendment, expect to get First Amendmented back. And if you are ignorant about our history, instead of rolling in pride about your ignorance, how about informing yourself? And so one of the things that's like, what can y'all do? You know, there's this documentary film that's now on Netflix. This is not just the Who We Are project. There's the 1619 project. There's all kinds of history that is around. When you talk to people about this, if you know people that have these views, bring this up. You don't have to say you're an asshole for wearing the Confederate flag or waving it around, but do you know the history behind that flag? And when they say it's about states' rights and Southern culture, you can say, why don't you go to your state's historical society and see what they say the flag is about? Because I understand and I even sympathize with or empathize with kind of the principle that's behind the question, but how would we react if somebody's carrying around a Nazi flag? Oh, I didn't know it was about killing Jews. I just thought it was about, you know, German nationalism and Germany trying to assert itself on the world stage. We wouldn't accept it for a second. And so when you say culpability, the ignorance that I find culpable is willful ignorance. And so it's one thing to be ignorant, never to have been exposed, but then when someone says something to you, you take some time to take a look at it and maybe reevaluate. But I think there are a lot of people who talk about this flag that are willfully ignorant. The people who are saying, this presentation that I just gave would be illegal in high schools across the country. It would be illegal. Why is that? Why are people so afraid of this information? And I'll tell you why. Because they know if people internalize it, America's heading in a different direction. Last question, I think, man, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. I just to know what you thought could be brought up. You did bring up like education. How do you think we could implement this type of response or education in the school system? Because, like you said, ignorance that you're not exposed. And how can we limit that ignorance where you're not exposed? And how would we go about that?
So I think there are a number of ways to go about that. One thing I would do is come to the Who We Are Project website. You will see all kinds of resources there. We have taken this film, broken it into 20-minute segments, had college professors do a study guide. And so in states that don't have anti-CRT laws, we are working to implement this, not to change anybody's curriculum, but to implement this into the curriculum to have people start talking about it and learning about it. When it comes to anti-CRT states, the Who We Are Project is raising money right now because we have plans for those states. We are going into the biggest cities, renting the biggest auditoriums, blanking a fortified county area around those auditoriums, going to student groups, teachers groups, parent groups, community groups, and putting on a day of learning on a Saturday, so nobody has to skip school. We hire Black-owned restaurants to feed everybody, and we have national and local experts talk about the history of anti-Black racism in those states. And so, for example, in Florida, we are hoping to do multiple cities there at the beginning of next year, and each one, we will have a huge chair with like fleece on it and everything with Governor Ron DeSantis's name on it. And we will invite him to each day of learning, which is what we're calling them. And the way we will advertise this is to tell the young people, this is what your state legislators don't want you to know. And we'll probably have some banned books for you to get as well. And I'll end by saying this, y'all are not that far away from being teenagers. The quickest way to get a teenager to read something is to tell her that she can't. And then to give her access to it by other organizations. So this desperate move, in my view, is bound to fail because it has no integrity behind it. And with technology the way it is today, you just can't keep things secret. I appreciate y'all coming. Thank you very much.
I have to say, we are honored, we are awed, we are depressed beyond the pale. And we are hopeful because of all of you and because of people like Jeff, who are truly traversing the country to educate us, to enlighten us, to illuminate us. I hope you take all of what you learned today and really go forth and share the information. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.